Next up, we welcome one of Canada's leading technology companies, powering small businesses in more than 140 countries. Shopify technology has become instrumental in the success of entrepreneurs around the globe. Here to tell us more about entrepreneurship in its many forms, put your hands together for our interviewer, Sean Silcoff of The Globe and Mail, who's also co-author of the new book, BlackBerry Losing the Signal, and of course, the founder and CEO of Shopify, Canada's very own Toby Lütke.
Wow. Hey, Toby, how you doing?
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Us?
Thanks everyone for coming.
So, Toby, here we are at Collision. There's 250 million people here. Everyone's talking about this moment that Toronto's having with startups. I mean, this seems to be the era of the startup. Entrepreneurialism seems to be alive and well, but you're not so sure about that.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, welcome everyone to Toronto. Toronto is an amazing city. We just expanded here. It's an amazing place to be, and it's a really appropriate location. I know everyone's an entrepreneur here. I like, though, at some point, I think it's important to go to the data. And so one thing I've been doing over the last couple of years is just draw attention to that the narrative that we tell ourselves within frankly, the technology bubble especially, isn't really fully valid. Like one thing we've seen is that although it is a fantastic time to be a programmer, go in a coffee shop with a laptop and build something like Shopify or Facebook or any of these things, entrepreneurship, that's just a very small part of entrepreneurship, and a lot, the actual numbers of new business formation are actually in decline and have been since the 70s. And so this actually has been accelerating the last couple of years, and so this is, I think, worthwhile to talk about in this context, because entrepreneurship is very important for today, for economies and for society in large.
I think you wrote in The Economist that the new business formation is down by like half since the 1970s. But when you look at the most valuable companies in the world, the 5 of the top 10, Tencent, Amazon, et cetera, they're under 25 years old. Every day I meet entrepreneurs who were inspired by success stories like yours and those ones. Do you think the network effect giants ultimately are creating more entrepreneurs or squeezing them out? And I mean, some people have called for the bust up of Facebook or Amazon to help sort of unleash more of this more competition.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is that I think ever since Milton Friedman, I think we've all been raised on a diet of that the competition is something to be crushed, and ideally you get your company to be of monopolistic size. And this is all really good advice if you can pull it off for your particular shareholders' returns. But that kind of engagement, these kind of things have very negative effects for society in certain situations. We've seen a lot of markets outside of tech, like mature markets, especially mature markets, where people are competing for percentages rather than increasing the size of the market, to get a stability at some point at an oligopoly or like a duopoly or something like this, which is, which fundamentally puts up barriers for new entries, and that can have severe impact, because I think what you want is like if you try to design the most healthy society you can possibly design, what you want is millions of small businesses that provide employment and ideas and put different voices into the ecosystem rather than 2 or 3 major employers and sources of the truth, so to speak.
Do you think breaking up the internet giants would help unleash sort of even more entrepreneurialism and smaller businesses?
I historically, breaking up anyone has usually led to them being put together in the next 20 years again. I don't think that might feel good in the short term, but I don't think solves the issue, because the broken up pieces are going to still have all the accumulated systematic advantages and moats that they've accumulated over time. I think it's, I mean, the way we organize this planet is that governments create, hopefully, markets in which a lot of competition happens, and therefore the effects of someone becoming too large are going to be inhibited to a certain degree. I think more regulation is a better option than necessarily breaking up the people who are already there.
Now, Shopify has how many customers now?
It's about 820,000 customers all around the world.
So these are entrepreneurs. I mean, if we take just that one data set and how much your customer set is growing, you'd think that entrepreneurialism is alive and well. Thank you very much. When you look though at your internal data, how do you see this decline that you worry about playing out? What sort of jumps out?
So here's the most amazing thing about Shopify in terms of at least with that vantage point. So we have 820,000 customers right now. I once didn't get an investment from a tier 1 VC company because they thought my entire addressable market was 40,000 online stores. And they actually didn't make a mistake in 2008. They were actually correct that back then there was a worldwide demand for 40,000 online stores, and that might actually have been optimistic on those times. So but there was a reason why that was the case. The reason was that it's really bloody hard to start these businesses, because what you had to do is, first of all, you need a lot of money because you needed to post like a $30,000 bond with a bank. You need to be a programmer, and programmers had better things to do in 2008 than start little retail stores on the corner. And there was all these reasons that all can be summarized with one word called friction. And so what Shopify has discovered is that there's actually a very, very large demand for people wanting to reach for independence, people wanting to go their own way, people wanting their own business. Everyone here understands this. But the reason why this demand can't be met is because of the friction of getting there. So every single time Shopify shipped something that has made it slightly easier to start a new business, it's actually the total amount of successful businesses on the platform increases. So as we are bringing down the difficulty, we see entrepreneurship going up. We don't create more demand, we just create more success. And so what that tells us is that the situation the internet has really created, initially, the initial state when Shopify started, was that it was too hard to start businesses. And once you look at for a lens of friction on the process of entrepreneurship, you'll be amazed, because the amount of friction that, just one thing, your example was Tencent, Facebook, Shopify, all these companies have started in the last, 15 years. All these companies were started by some, usually programmers, sitting in a coffee shop, needing a permission by no one. Try to start a hairdressing salon, a salon today. You know how many licenses you need? You know how much friction was put in there by the people who already had them, just to make it harder for new entrants? And this is the kind of thing that's kind of everywhere, and I think this is the thing that's stifling entrepreneurship at this point.
So what can the big institutions in society, whether it's government or financial institutions or tech companies, do you think, to reduce some of that friction and spur on this entrepreneurialism?
I mean, having a good look at licensing is it will make a significant, I think, impact on in certain markets. Again, most entrepreneurship is not tech startups. Most entrepreneurship is plumbing shops and hairdressers and all these kind of these kind of things. And they are really important for society, because one of those business employees creates 10, 20 good jobs, and if we want people to have work to do, this is really, really important that we preserve this kind of thing. So what government can do is just take a friction-based approach to looking at what's actually in the way. Registering a new business is one entry in a database, obfuscated behind an enormous amount of trips to city halls and filling out forms and all these kind of things for no particular reason, right? And so I think that's the direction that we should take. We should demystify this process in schools, because one thing we see even in our surveys on Shopify is we ask, at what point have you come in contact with other entrepreneurs during your lifetime? And the answer is almost inevitably some family member. Like in my case, my grandma was an entrepreneur. She started a printing business. And I loved spending time there. And to me, the concept of you know something that needs to be done, you start a company around this. This is sort of part of my toolbox that I got handed by my family growing up. If that wouldn't have been true, I probably wouldn't have used that tool or didn't know that I have this ability. So I think those are the kind of things that governments can affect.
Did you grow up wanting to be an entrepreneur, or did you even know you wanted to be one after you started the forerunner to Shopify?
No, not really. I mean, I didn't. Again, this is how little. It was no big deal for me to start a company because it was just an ordinary potential thing you would do, just because that's what I've had role modeled by my family, by my grandmother. And so I didn't realize the ceremony around it. I didn't realize the mythicism around entrepreneurship. I only learned about the term entrepreneur like many years after I started Shopify. It just was like starting a company is a tool that was a valid tool to use in the situation I found myself in, where I had the software I used for my snowboard store and then wanted to turn this into something that everyone can use to start their own businesses.
I want to switch gears a little bit. The tech sector, although this is a giant celebration of all things tech and innovation, has obviously come under a lot of criticism in the last couple of years. Whether it's concerns about social media. Saw what Selena Gomez, the most popular Instagrammer I think in the world, had to say at Cannes the other day about how much of a negative effect it's having on young girls. Trolls, fake news, whether Facebook is a threat to democracy, and so on and so forth. What do you think are the big topics about tech and its impact on society that we should really be focusing on, or that really concern you?
It's very hard to talk about tech, my 2 cents. I think the tech industry has hidden behind the term tech to a large degree, partly to obfuscate the fact that there's one company controlling search, one company controlling social media. Those are really separate industries and would have been separate industry at any other point in history. We don't feel like, Shopify doesn't feel like part of tech even. Like we feel like a company that while we use technology, we build technology so that non-technical people can actually enter the global digital economy and enter the world economy and so on. Bridging the gap between something they had the ability on before and need again after the internet emerged. I mean, in terms of a societal impact, I think some of the criticism is deserved, but I think largely what tech and social media specifically do is they're holding a giant mirror up to society, and we kind of don't love what we're seeing to a certain degree. There are certain parts of social media which clearly, every village ever had a couple of people in it who said really crazy stuff, usually on soapboxes. Once you connect all of them, they look like much more of a groundswell in a movement and can get more followers. Like there's these elements which need to, there's systematic things around this which the platforms have to take the ownership of controlling, and I think they are committed to this, and I think they will. But basically, it's a mirror, right? So we have to have a conversation about what we want. I believe the effects on society, those will be solved. I think the larger problem is the externalities of the business model of these companies. Because, the impact on our attention is significant, and these kind of things, that's where regulation really ought to arrive. And I would be very surprised if not every leader of these companies would agree with that statement, that we have to find some kind of common ground for how much impact we can have on the way people spend their time, because otherwise there's going to be a war for every second of everyone's day, and that doesn't lead to anything good.
A lot of tech leaders have talked about how they actually limit their kids' access to the very technologies that they've brought upon the world. How you, like I, have 3 kids, and if your family's like mine, there's a constant struggle about access to screen time. How are you managing? I know you grew up playing a lot of video games, and I think you still do. what's your sort of rule around the house about access to screens and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I was a little bit surprised reading these stories about how apparently some people are completely like. I mean, I'm certainly not in that camp. I'm pretty pro video games. I think if you could open, like obviously please don't do this, but if you could look into the brain of a kid playing video games, what you might see on a screen is it might look violent or something like this, or like Fortnite doesn't look like much, but the amount of thought that's going into every behavior they have, there's so much planning, there's so much like chasing of mastery. There's like I think this is really this is actually very fulfilling kind of things people do and kids do in a world that doesn't really give a lot of outlets for a kid kind of chasing mastery over something in a very sort of pure form. So I'm very pro it. Like they are restricted screen times. They are fairly liberal in my household. We have a Minecraft server. We all sometimes building things together, including my wife, and it's really fun to do. So, I think I think there's a lot of bad data that came from people analyzing the effects of parents replacing babysitters with televisions, which is really not the situation that exists around iPads and the quality video games that exist at this point. So I think like I'm willing to take the gamble that we'll find out that video games have a very important role to play, and I think kids' history and them growing up, everything needs some form of moderation. But like I'm somewhat liberal on this point.
Okay. One question I've been wanting to ask you: a lot of tech billionaires like Bill Gates or Jeff Skoll went on to have second lives as benefactors or builders of another legacy. Dax De Silva, one of your counterparts in the tech world in Canada, is urging people to become change makers. You're a billionaire, it's no secret now. Have you thought ahead of what your responsibility or future legacy is that you'd like to leave for the world beyond building Shopify? Or can you talk about maybe some of the projects that you've done in your spare time and how they sort of capture what you want to leave behind other than building a very large business?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is most people in this incredibly fortunate situation that I find myself also in, run a strategy of sort of, I mean, this is really created by Rockefeller, where he built a giant vampire squid monopoly at first, and then spent the second part of his life making up for it in incredible ways. We can all be thankful for modern medicine, to the Rockefeller Foundation, and so on. I think this is, like, I'm hoping that I can avoid that, because what I would rather all of us have to do is not build vampire squid style companies in first place. I think people should have a very clear appreciation of what happens if your company is successful. What are the bad effects of this? Because I think once you're aware of this, you can actually choose business models and industries that where your success means that instead of negative effects, such as we're polluting the planet, but actually positive externalities happen, such as more people are enabled to be able to reach for independence by starting their own companies. That's an externality that exists when every time Shopify, in my case, like makes our product simpler to use. So I think the way the world works is like most of the changes in the world are actually driven by market forces, and then building companies with this in mind is powerful. That being said, I do think that there's a large role. Like a lot of communities have significant assets which cannot come out because there's a lack of investment. So like I'm very interested in mental health. I'm interested in children learning to code because it's enabled so much for me. Me and my compatriots at Shopify, we're all very, like, I mean, at least the Ottawa-based part of Shopify is very interested in turning Ottawa, like, into one of the coolest places in the world to be. Like we're going to be building the kinds of things people in Toronto are envious of, which has never happened before. So we'll bring them to Toronto afterwards. And this is the kind of, I think this is the kind of ways how we get engaged, and I'm not going to compare my chapter 1 in this pursuit to Bill Gates's or Jeff Bezos's chapter 20. So I'm much earlier in my journey, but I'm very interested in these topics at this point.
We'll come back for Collision 2030, and we can get the update.
I'll have a good story to tell by then. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Go.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.